Welcome to the third of our leader interviews. We're here at the Francis Crick Institute at King's Cross in central London. When construction and fitting out are complete here, this will be one enormous biomedical research centre. Top scientists will come here to put their minds to curing diseases. Before they arrive, though, we're using this remarkable location to meet top politicians to hear their thoughts on curing the country's ills. Today, Ed Miliband, leader of the Labour Party, is in the chair. Ed Miliband, I'd like to start with some of the judgments that have been made over this Parliament. There have been lots of arguments about economic policy and other things. Can we just look back at some of them? Let's start on jobs. Now, at the beginning of the Parliament, Ed Balls, Shadow Chancellor, said it was fantasy to think we'd get job growth with all the cuts being made in the public sector. What's happened to jobs over the last 5 years?
I think what Ed Balls was doing was quoting what the Office of Budget Responsibility and many people were saying, which is there'd be a very, very big impact on public sector jobs, and there are deep questions about whether the private sector jobs could make up the shortfall. Now, it does go to the big argument of this election. You know, the Conservative Party want to say the economy's fixed and everything's fine, because there are more jobs in our economy. I don't believe that. I think that too many of the jobs are insecure, low-paid.
But what's happened to the number of jobs? The judgment was about the number of jobs.
The number of jobs has gone up. But, you know, Evan, I'm going to let people in this election make the judgment about whether that means the economy's fixed or not.
Well, it's gone up by about 2 million, hasn't it? About 1,000 a day. Let's take crime. Yvette Cooper said, the government are taking a gamble with crime and policing, just as they're taking a gamble with the economy. They're cutting too far and too fast. They're risking growth and jobs. And now they're risking public safety and the fight against crime. What's happened on crime?
Well, violent crime's actually up. So there are worries about violent crime, and there are big questions about what's going to happen to policing in the next Parliament. But you know,
what has happened to crime overall? Well, look, I mean, reported crimes are up in some areas, and there are questions over whether reported crime is the right measure of those, because people. But look, I mean, you're
definitely right that there is a number of statistics that the government cites to say everything's fine in the country and everything's doing well.
What has happened to crime?
Certain areas of crime has gone down, certain areas of crime have gone up. But let's go to the big argument of this election: is the country fixed or is the country not fixed? Now, I don't believe.
I'm just asking about crime. What's happened to crime?
Well, I said some areas of crime have fallen.
Well, the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which is taken as the best measure generally, estimates crimes at its lowest level since the study began in 1981. Let's take another one. This is tuition fees. Chuka Amuna, speaking in 2010 when the government put up tuition fees in England, he said, how can these proposals do other than deter people from poor backgrounds from going to university? What has happened to the number of poor people going to university, people from poorer backgrounds?
Well, what I know is that there are about 12 times more people from advantaged, privileged backgrounds going to university than disadvantaged backgrounds.
What's happened in the last 5 years?
And that isn't good enough for me in the country. But look.
But what's happened to those from poorer backgrounds?
There are some more people going to university from different backgrounds.
It's gone up by a third in the last 5 years.
And so the problem's fixed, is it?
I'm not saying it's fixed.
No, exactly, but that goes to the argument. But let me break this point.
The judgment that was made,
I understand,
was wrong.
No, I understand. No, it wasn't wrong, and let me explain why.
But you said
because it isn't good enough.
People.
It isn't good enough for me that you're 12 times more likely to get to university from an advantage compared to a disadvantaged background, Evan. And that goes to the big argument of this election. Is this good enough for Britain? Is it good enough for Britain in jobs, in policing, in educational opportunity? I say no. I say we can be a country that's actually run for working people, not for the richest and most powerful, and that is still the state of Britain. And you know what? On May the 7th, let me make this point. On May the 7th, the public will reach their judgment about that. So you can definitely read off a whole list of statistics. Government ministers,
reading off your judgment.
Government ministers do it. David Cameron does it opposite me in the House of Commons. But I don't think that actually speaks to what's happening in people's living rooms up and down this country. But we're going to find out soon enough in 2.5 weeks' time.
So on issues about jobs, crime, social mobility, comments, predictions made by people in your team turn out to have been wrong. These are important areas. These are not minor quibbles, are they? These are huge issues that have had a large part to play in the last 5 years.
I don't think that's the judgment people are going to make at the election.
Let's look ahead. Let's go to borrowing and the deficit. Now, you have set out a budget responsibility lock to establish fiscal credibility. You want to get the deficit down. We're clear about that. And there are various sentences that you and your team use repeatedly to tell us what the policy is. But still there's a slight lack of clarity, isn't there? And I just want to cut through this. Is it right to say that compared to the plans that the Conservative Party have, whether they meet their plans is a different question, compared to the plans, you will spend more than the Conservatives and you will borrow more and be doing so at the end of the Parliament?
Well, let me set out what our plans actually are, because I think it's important that people at home know what they are. It's to have a surplus on the current budget. That means that day-to-day spending is more than covered by tax revenues. Secondly, that net debt is going to be falling, so that's debt as a proportion of national income. And thirdly, something very, very important, which is, you know, in a way is a judgment on our manifesto. Not a penny of what we're promising is funded by extra borrowing. Unlike the Conservative Party, who are promising £25 billion more.
Right, now look, I'm going to be honest, I've actually written out those sentences you've used, and I've got it before we got here. We'll cut the deficit every year, you hadn't said, but that was one I had written. We'll get national debt falling, surplus on the current budget as soon as possible in the next Parliament. Everything in our manifestos is costed. But you haven't answered the question as to whether borrowing at the end of the Parliament, whether borrowing will be bigger than the Conservative plan.
I'll tell you why I don't believe it will, because the Conservatives said they would eliminate the deficit in this Parliament, and they failed to do so. So they've made the spending cuts, but they haven't cut the deficit as promised. And I think the same would be true in the next Parliament. But let me answer.
Bigger than their plans.
Let me set out.
We can question
but I don't
whether
believe
their
their plans.
is,
I don't believe their plans. Let me set out the differences I see at the election. There are some people who come along and say there don't need to be any cuts, right? I'm not one of those people. I've set out very clearly there need to be reductions. I'm the first Labour leader going into an election saying outside key protected areas like health and education, spending is actually going to be falling. There's another plan, the Tory plan, that says you should accelerate the spending cuts, double the cuts next year. I think ours is a balanced plan which involves reductions in spending and involves tax changes, like, for example, reversing David Cameron's millionaires tax cut.
It doesn't sound like you have a plan, though, because what you're unable to do is to tell me how much you will be borrowing on current economic projections. We know these projections go awry and that there may be more and maybe less, but you're unable to tell me how much you will be borrowing at the end of the Parliament.
Well, I can make this assurance, make this assurance, right, which is that we're going to have a surplus on the current budget and net debt falling as soon as possible in the next Parliament. I want to go to this issue of as soon as possible because this is the issue here. George Osborne set a lot of timetables, set a lot of dates, right? He missed most of those dates. I think, and I made a speech on this in December on our deficit plan, I think the sensible thing to do is to set a framework for fiscal policy over the course of the coming Parliament, and that's what we've done.
Look, I'm going to... There are two deficits, right? There's the current one, which you say you're going to get rid of, and there's the other one left, the capital one. There'll be water in this glass. This is borrowing to cover capital spending. The Conservatives say both those glasses will be empty. You've said
I don't
they
believe
won't
it's going to
achieve it.
happen.
Right. Well, that's a question we must put to them. How much, within 10 billion, do you expect to be in that second glass by the end of the Parliament? How much is going to be left in there?
Let me explain why that's not a sensible question. Let me explain. It isn't. Let me explain why. You know it's not. Let me explain why. Look, we're going to have a surplus on the current budget, right? We want it.
I've dealt with that.
Let me answer the question. We want a surplus on the current budget as soon as possible in the next Parliament. Now, what does that depend on? We're going to make spending reductions, set out the tax changes we're going to make, but it depends crucially on something else, which is economic growth. Why have the Tories failed on the deficit in this Parliament? Because they made the cuts, but because they didn't get the growth, the rise in living standards, tax revenues fell, and they didn't meet it. So I'm not going to play your game with the glass of water. It's very inventive. Well done.
After the election, if you have a budget, you're going to make financial projections over the next 5 years, and you will tell us how much you expect to be in that glass.
I'm going to do something more than that.
And you're unable to tell us that now.
No, I'm going to do something more than that. I'm going to tell you the first line of Labour's first budget, which is that we're going to
get the deficit down every year.
But that's quite significant,
yes.
isn't it?
That's the other glass.
We're going to cut
or is that both glasses or the other glass?
We're going to cut the deficit every year, and we're going to have a surplus on the current budget as soon as possible in the next Parliament.
That you keep repeating. Okay, so I think your supporters will be deeply disappointed that you are...
I don't think they will.
Deeply disappointed that you are apparently so embarrassed about your policy to borrow more than the Conservatives are planning to do, that you actually can't utter the words, we will borrow more, because that is the right thing to do.
But you know why I don't believe it? I mean, you know, look, we've got a sensible plan on the deficit, which is to balance the books.
But
they want to go much.
Can't utter the words.
They want to go much further. But let me just tell you why I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do, because remember at the beginning of this Parliament, you were talking about predictions. They didn't just make a prediction; they made a promise that they would clear the deficit in this Parliament. Now they failed. Now that goes to the big.
Within 10 billion. No, the experts are all saying it's 30 billion is the difference between you and the Conservatives.
Let me make this point, Evan, because it is very relevant to people at home. I'll tell you why this is important. Because why did they fail? Right? They failed because they didn't understand that you can't simply cut your way to deficit reduction. You've got to get a growing economy, rising living standards, and therefore the right thing to do, credibility, you know about these issues, credibility matters in fiscal policy. The way you get credibility is not picking...
Exactly.
Let me make the point. But not by picking out an arbitrary number today in 6 years' time. If you were, you'd be, if I was doing that, you'd be saying, come on, Mr. Miliband, you're picking out an arbitrary number, doesn't make sense. It's to set a clear framework.
A better plan. Your slogan is a better plan. And generally, it is thought of as a better plan is offering a fiscal path for the next few years, a path of borrowing, and you're unable to do that. Nicola Sturgeon has no problem in saying she believes in more borrowing and more spending. She doesn't like the Tory way.
I don't agree with Nicola Sturgeon. Right. I don't agree with Nicola.
But your policy is to borrow more. Lots of experts think your policy is better than the Conservative policy.
But that's an important point. Let me just explain the three positions. There is what you call Nicola Sturgeon's position. She says no cuts are necessary. There's the Tory plan, which is to double the cuts next year. I don't think that's a sensible position. And there's our plan, which is a sensible plan.
Right. A lot of the credibility that is so important you have built up over the last 5 years has been with Ed Balls, your Shadow Chancellor. Can you assure us that he will be Chancellor if you form the next government?
Well, I've always said that I don't do measuring the curtains because, you know, my focus is on up to May the 7th. I think Ed Balls is an excellent Shadow Chancellor. I think you can take it from my answer, what I'm planning to do. I'm not going to start appointing members of my cabinet. But I think Ed Balls has shown over the last 4 years and in this campaign that he is somebody who's not just capable of being Chancellor, but an excellent Chancellor.
Why can't you just tell us? I mean, you know,
because I don't do
it was clear with David Cameron.
Sure, I'm giving you a pretty clear indication, but I don't do measuring the curtains. I don't do starting appointing my cabinet because I think it's presumptuous. I think the British people have got a big decision to make. I'm giving you a very clear indication.
Right. Scotland. On your watch as leader of the Labour Party, something huge has happened there. I think at the last election, Labour got, about twice the votes of the SNP. In the polls now, the SNP have about twice the votes of the Labour Party. Your personal standing in the polls there is behind David Cameron. Do you take responsibility for what's happening there?
Of course I take responsibility for everything that's happening in the election and that's happened over the last 5 years. I think what we saw in Scotland was, in the referendum, a deeply, if you like, divisive moment. A moment that divided Scotland, 45-55, yes versus no. I think one of our tasks is to show people that this election is not a rerun of the referendum. It's about something else. It's about, do you have a Labour government or a Conservative government? There are lots of people in Scotland who don't want a Conservative government. I'm urging them to vote Labour, but also because of the commitments we're making to build a country that properly works for working people. I think it's the big argument of this election. And I think people in Scotland are actually on our side in the kind of country they want to build. And I hope they'll vote Labour for a higher minimum wage, to ban the exploitation of zero-hours contracts, to have a mansion tax on the most expensive properties above £2 million, to help fund the health service across the UK. Right. You know, I'm a deep believer in the United Kingdom. I'm a believer in more devolution, but also that we are stronger together, and that's, you know, that's about solidarity and redistribution.
Now, if you're the biggest party in Parliament, but you're not the biggest in England, and you effectively end up ruling England only with the support, through a deal or through no deal, you end up ruling England with the support of the SNP. Is there going to be all hell to pay, do you think, in England?
I don't do hypotheticals.
Well, you do. You've talked about you're not going to do a coalition with the SNP.
No, that's because the Conservatives were spreading a ridiculous falsehood. But look, honestly,
well, they're going to. You've addressed one hypothetical.
We've got 2.5 weeks to go till the general election. I take an old-fashioned view. We put the issues before people. We don't get into all of the process business. We put the issues before people about what kind of country we want to build, and then the voters choose and the voters decide. And I think that is actually the right way to do it. And I actually think the British people deserve better than a inside the beltway discussion about permutations and hypotheticals and all that. Let's talk about the issues. There are huge issues about the future of young people,
look,
whether we reward work again in this country,
our
health service.
A lot of people think, a lot of people perhaps in England, some perhaps in Wales, think the SNP calling the shots on what a Labour government that may not have the support
That ain't
of
going to
England.
happen. That ain't going to happen.
But how can you say it's not going to happen if you rely on their votes to get English measures passed, if you don't have a majority of English and Welsh MPs? How can you say it's not going to happen?
It will be, you know, the House of Commons works in a very simple way. It's for people in the House of Commons to decide how they vote on measures put before the House of Commons, and that will be the case after the election. That's one forecast I can confidently.
Right.
I can confidently.
So you're not worried about the
make.
situation in which you might end up relying on SNP support, even without a deal, in which they will tell you what measures in England are going to apply?
They're not going to tell us. They're not going to tell us. Look, I'm very clear about that.
As a matter of constitutional principle, after the election, do you think it is important that the biggest party in the Commons, the biggest party, the one with the most seats, should be given the kind of time and space to form a government? It has the moral legitimacy.
I'm really sorry to
form
be
a government.
disappointing about this, but I'm afraid I'm not going to get into post-election speculation. Look, there are massive issues facing the country.
But these are constitutional, hugely important.
Yeah, and no doubt we'll discuss them if any matter arises after the election. We'll discuss it. But honestly, there are huge issues facing people watching tonight.
But Ed Miliband, don't you think it's actually rather important for the public when they come to vote to be thinking about permutations and possible outcomes that are going to result? These are not just sort of vague, weird hypotheticals that I'm talking about. These are things that are indicated by all the polls at the moment and all the forecasts.
You know what I think? When I go around the country, you know, people are asking about the permutations in their own lives. They're asking whether they're going to be able to pay the bills at the end of the month. They're going to ask whether somebody's going to stand up to the energy companies and the tax avoiders and the banks. They're asking whether I recognise what they feel, which is Britain doesn't work for them. It may work for the richest, but it doesn't work for them. That's the big argument at this election. It's the big argument facing us. It's our generational question, the question of inequality, who the country works for. That is the big question. And you know, countries all around the world are facing it, and we've got to address that in the remaining 2.5 weeks.
I think you find it difficult to talk about these outcomes, and you want to wait until you see what the outcome is before you make your mind up as to what you want to say.
I take an old-fashioned view, which is that you let the people decide.
Right. Can we quickly talk about the NHS? You've criticised the current government for reorganising the NHS in England. The government has spent billions on a top-down reorganisation that the NHS is still reeling from, you said. Can you assure us there will be no top-down reorganisation of the NHS on your watch?
Yes.
Now, because your manifesto says we'll repeal the Health and Social Care Act, scrap the competition regime, restore proper democratic accountability, and establish a sensible commissioning framework. That sounds a bit like a top-down reorganisation.
No,
why is that not a top-down?
Shall I go through? Let me go through the issues, but they are important.
Well, very, very briefly. But
well,
it's
I'm
just trying to get at whether it's a reorganisation or whether.
And it's not a top-down.
So explain why it isn't a top-down.
Okay, I'll definitely reorganise. There are two important things here. The first important thing is the most important reason to repeal the Health and Social Care Act is that it's based on the idea that every service in the NHS should be subject to being contracted out, competitive tendering, privatisation. I think that's dangerous for the NHS. But I think the task for the NHS is an integrated service. It's about health care, it's about physical health, mental health, social care, working better together. Now, on the question of how we're going to have this more integrated service without a top-down reorganisation, it's a very good report, which I'd recommend you and others read, by someone called John Oldham, that we commissioned on this. And what it says is, you set a direction of travel at the centre, but it's for people locally to actually work together, collaborate together. But we are absolutely not talking about reshuffling the deck chairs and all of that, because I don't think that would be a good. I don't think that would be a good thing. It's not what the health service wants. You know, it's so damaging. David Cameron's reforms diverted billions of pounds from the NHS. People waiting longer in A&E, longer for their operations, longer for their test results. I'm really worried about the future of the NHS under David Cameron. We're not going to have a top-down reorganisation.
Okay. I want to just go look at some ideas and beliefs you have And I want to start this by playing a little clip to you. This is a clip of Margaret Thatcher. Actually, it's the day she was dethroned from her leadership of the Conservative Party. She was facing questions in the House of Commons, and she tried to set out the difference between her and socialists in their view of inequality. Let's have a look at the clip over there.
They'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap were that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, so long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer.
I think she was wrong.
The point she was making is that socialists, she used the phrase that the socialists don't care how poor we are as long as the gap is smaller. Can you nail on the head? You would rather we were all richer, even if the gap wasn't even if the gap was wider.
I think that misreads the evidence and the way the country succeeds. And let me explain why. Look, the old view, and this is what Lady Thatcher was saying there, is that inequality, so a more unequal society, could somehow be better for everybody. Better for the richest, because they were obviously richer, and better for the poorest, because they were richer too. It doesn't work like that. I mean, it hasn't worked. In fact, there's a huge amount of evidence now from around the world that more unequal societies are less successful societies. Why? Because if you don't train your young people, then you're losing out as a country and you are less prosperous. If you try and believe that people can subsist on extremely low wages, that isn't good for people. That isn't good for the people at the bottom of our society on the lowest wages. But it doesn't make for a productive country either. You know, productivity in this country is actually its lowest level for 25 years. So if the Thatcher idea of a race to the bottom, as I call it, low wages, insecure work, was the way to succeed as a country, well, we might be succeeding now, but I don't believe we are. So I think she's sort of wrong in belief, wrong in evidence, wrong in outcome.
But you know, there were years over the last Labour government, weren't there, when we were getting less equal, but we were becoming more rich. Are you saying that was all a disaster because we did become richer and we became less equal?
I'm not saying that from time to time that may be,
so would that be a failure? If you were in charge for 5 years and at the end of those 5 years everybody was 30% richer, you had stupendous economic performance, but that the gap had widened, to suppose that had happened, would you say, it's not likely to, you say, but if
it's not going to happen, no.
Would that be a failure?
No, look, but the evidence is just different from what you say. The evidence is, we've got to go by the evidence here.
But it does sometimes happen. You've already said it sometimes
But let me go to the central, I think, test of my economic policy. The central test of my economic policy is, does the growth in our economy, is it reflected in what's happening to the living standards of working people? You see, I call it the cost of living crisis. That's what people call it. And what is that about? That's about that the growth in the economy has become detached from the living standards of ordinary families. So those at the top are getting a large share of the pie. It's happening in the United States, it's happening here. And other people, it's not just the poorest, by the way. That's a new inequality. It's not just the richest versus the poorest. It's the richest versus everyone else. That isn't success in my view. Right. It doesn't make for a successful country.
And it wouldn't be a success. I just want to nail this. It really wouldn't be a success on your view if you ruled the country for 5 years and at the end of it, we were all a tiny bit poorer, but the gap was much narrower.
We were all a tiny bit poorer.
Well, yes, so the poor are a little bit poorer, tiny bit poorer.
No, I don't want us to be poorer. Definitely not. I can tell you that would be unsuccessful.
That would be unsuccessful.
Yeah, definitely.
So the gap matters.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't trade off living standard for gap, so to speak. You would rather have...
Well, I don't really agree with the trade-off, as I've tried to explain, because I actually think that inequality, as I say, is damaging for prosperity. And that's what all the evidence... Look, you've got the International Monetary Fund, right, not known for being a kind of left-wing kind of rabble, not known for being a kind of far-left organisation. Even they're producing papers now saying that the gap is a problem.
The gap is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's not just a problem. It's not just a problem, but it makes us less prosperous. So the Thatcher view's wrong.
Let's just talk a little about welfare and the people at the bottom. Do you believe there are any people, the poor, who you would call undeserving poor?
I don't like the phrase, but there are definitely people who are, and it's a minority, who could work but aren't doing so, and we need to get them back to work, and we've got to be tough. because I think responsibility is important. I think responsibility is a foundation for a successful welfare system. I think you need responsibility and you need compassion. And both of them are incredibly important parts of a welfare system. I don't think this government's got either of them right, frankly.
Do you think parents who would like another child but know they can't afford to look after their child, they're going to rely on extra benefits, or they're going to need social housing or more housing benefit, do you think those parents should say, we can't afford to look after our child, we shouldn't have this kid, or wait until we've got better income? Or do you think it's reasonable to say, look, the state should help us out here and we can have that child?
Well, you know, I think that the judgment that parents make about whether they have more children is an incredibly personal judgment. And I don't really think it's for politicians to tell parents whether they should have another child.
You're reluctant to get drawn into sort of nannying or be seen to be.
Well, I think it's a very odd person who aspires to be Prime Minister who starts telling parents, I want you to have X number of children. I think they do it in some countries, but it's not going to be part of a Miliband government. No. I can promise you.
But you can see people who think I'm going to wait till I can afford for a child may think I don't want to be paying taxes for other people who just have a kid and expect the state to pick up the bill.
Let's talk about the way the system works. The system works in this way, which is that we have child benefit and child tax credits, which are a recognition of the importance of us supporting families in this country. I think that's important to recognise it. Why is that important? It's important for all of us, because with an ageing population, actually you need people in the workforce working to support us, me, you, in our old age. That's important. But responsibility is an important principle in welfare. You know, that's why we've got policies that say, if you're a young person who's been out of work more than a year, we're going to offer you a job, compulsory jobs guarantee, but if you don't take the job, you'll lose benefits. Similarly for the long-term unemployed. So responsibility matters. Ed Miliband telling people how many children to have, an ex-child policy is not in my manifesto.
Right. Look, we're coming to a close. I want to just finish actually on the Margaret Thatcher theme, because looking at where the country is now, you have said it's rather like perhaps where it was in 1979, at one of these pivotal turning points. I think you said it's a similar moment in the sense of the old order crumbling without it being 100% clear as to what's going to replace it. She was a conviction politician. I think you're a conviction politician. She was underestimated when she was in opposition. People, I think you say the same about you. How relevant do you think the parallels between you and Margaret Thatcher are? Taking it as read, you're not of the same beliefs as her. How much parallel should we draw?
Well, I think comparisons like that are invidious, and I don't really want to be compared to a Conservative Prime Minister. The way I'd put it slightly differently, which is I'd compare myself to previous Labour Prime Ministers. Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, they all came in and said we need to change the old way of running things. It was true in 1945, never again, back to what we'd seen in the 30s, but we built an NHS, or that government built the NHS. Harold Wilson, the white heat of technology. Tony Blair, crumbling public realm, rebuild public services. I believe that we do need to call time on the old way of running things. And in a way, the Thatcher clip is quite relevant to this. There's an old idea that if you look after the richest in our society, the wealth magically trickles down to everybody else. The problem is it doesn't work. And we've had that experiment over the last 5 years and we've failed. And therefore, that's why when I say it's only when working people succeed that the country succeeds, that isn't just a political slogan. That is a reality about who you put first in your country and how a country succeeds. You know, are we going to have a Prime Minister? The kind of Prime Minister I want to be, I'll be thinking every day, how do we reward the hard work of everyone in our country? How do we give every young person an opportunity? How do we have a rescue plan for our NHS? And we are going to have a rescue plan for our NHS. And we're very, very clear about that.
Ed Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you.
The Leader debates continue on Wednesday night at 7:30 as Evan Davis interviews UKIP leader Nigel Farage.